Why is there no political party that represents the interests of ordinary people? Why do both political parties, when it comes to the crunch, work entirely for corporate elites? I spoke to Jeremy Gilbert, who's an academic on the left, about this, and I talked to him specifically about what the left can do to change their politics, to make their politics more relevant to ordinary people. I talked to him about centralisation. I talked to him about the necessity for a new populism, a populism of the left. Have a look at this video, stay all the way to the end, because I want to know what you think about it. If you think there's a new type of politics waiting to be born, if you've got any faith at all in any existing party, whether you're in Australia, America, England, France, Tanzania, wherever you are, do you believe that your political system has within it the ingredients for real change? Stay to the end. Now, there's a few things that I want to touch on about, like, you know, if you like the current centre left, I think has become dominated by authoritarianism and puritanism and is like become bereft ideologically. And like, you know, when I look at, you talk about your reclaim the streets type days, and I sort of drifted around on the periphery of their movements, mostly because I kind of liked it. I liked the vibe and everything. I also sensed there was something important about it, but I wasn't sort of embedded in groups that would, you know, I got some friends that knew the score on this kind of stuff and gradually did their best to teach me about it. But I like the energy of it. And what I feel is that these kind of, like the current sort of technocratic political ideals of the left are not going to deliver anything. And I also am doubtful, suspicious, cynical even about the possibility of the institutions and systems that we currently have can ever deliver anything. And I sort of even I mean that, like, you know, when you say sort of like we need to kick on with the Labour Party national executive and momentum, and I don't know enough. I'm not like, you know, I recognise people know a lot more than I do and put a lot more time and effort in than I do, and I'm like that. I'm not trying to gainsay that, but when I feel about the kind of emotional quality, the energy that's going to be required for people, like, you know, the willingness to sacrifice, the willingness to come together, the willingness to confront, and indeed, like you said, like, you know, the willingness to overlook differences. Like, you know, you see, I remember like years ago, like, you know, I guess 5 years ago now, seeing some sort of Tommy Robinson style thing kicking off in London, like a sort of, for those that don't know, a kind of like a ethno-nationalist, populist, proletariat type movement. And when I sort of see them, I feel like, how can the left not get these people? Like, how can you not get them? How can you not get white working class people who are pissed off they're not earning enough money and have got like shit jobs and are being treated bad? If you can't get, if they're going right, if they're heading right, I blame you for not being able to get them. Like, you know, like the you know, the fall of the red wall, that people would rather vote for Boris Johnson, that they would rather vote for Trump. I'm like, well, where's your game at? Where's your game at? And for me now, I'm at the point, like when I spoke to Curtis about this, he said, like, you know, I was saying, like, you know, at the moment, like a movement that would confront capitalist power is more likely to come out of the right than the left. Like, you know, and like, you know, like sort of when it comes to identity, sexuality, immigration, climate, like, you know, a long list of things. I'm like, oh, no, not these guys. But when it comes to sort of verve and like a bit of mojo and a little bit of energy, I'm thinking, like, you know, like Curtis said, like, you know, look, it doesn't have to be the right. It might come out of, like, emerging from these sort of movement, emerging from this emotion, because, like, you know, ultimately no one's really like, oh, well, you know, is it a boy or is it a girl? It's a right wing baby, it's a Tottenham fan. You know, this all just, you know what I mean, it's all just been inculcated and can just as easily my prairies be stripped away. So, like, on the edge of that, and I'm sure you've got loads and loads of things to pick up on that, I wanted to sort of say that, don't you feel like that our energy ought to be heading in the direction of, I don't know, sort of forms of anarchism, forms of devolution, new forms of confederacy, something that is vibrant and engaging emotionally and spiritually, that sort of makes the kind of, that the clerical necessity of the stinky brick clear up out the middle of the road less relevant, sort of, you know, drive around it type thing.
Yeah, I totally do. I would say, again, I mean, I sort of think both positions have to be understood as right at the same time. Like, you can't avoid the stinky bricklayer up and what you said is true. I mean, and how I would bring those things together is to say, look, one thing we've learned from the past 30 years is, for the left in Britain at least, the only way you get a platform is by at least seriously challenging the leadership of the Labour Party. Because there's been people who think, I mean, I've been saying the stuff you've just said. I mean, I've been writing about, how basically, I mean, the argument of my book, sort of Common Ground, and other stuff I've written over the years is really, look, liberal representative democracy has been broken since the 70s because nobody voted for this stuff, basically. Like you can go right back to the early 80s and say most of the people voting for Thatcher, they weren't voting for privatization and deregulation of the financial markets. They thought she was promising to take us back to the sort of their imagined traditional Britain of the 50s, but they didn't get what they were voting for. Most people who voted for Blair were hoping he was going to restore social democracy and reverse Thatcherism. They didn't get that either. So the whole thing's been broken since the mid 70s, right? The thing is, people like me have been banging on about that for 30 years, that we can't get a platform to say it. The only time we've come close to getting a platform is when, we were able to use the Labour Party doing it. I mean, I was down on bended. I was literally in, Parliament talking to advisors of Corbyn's, like while he was leader, and also while Ed was leader, actually, giving them the same spiel, saying, listen, you've got to give a speech, and the speech has got to say this. Look, this whole system of liberal representative democracy has been broken since the 70s. We know it has. We know it doesn't work. We've got to do something very different. And that is, and we don't even know what that is. We would have to have a massive national conversation about what that different thing would be. And this isn't impossible. I mean, all over Latin America, you've had radical governments in places like Bolivia, institute what they call a constituent assembly, where you have a national process of saying, well, what would it mean to build new kinds of democratic institutions, ones that are more, as you say, more devolved, more participatory. They're not based on the sort of 18th century model of like choosing some guy who goes down to a big committee in London and you don't see him again for 4 years. So that's all doable. But I mean, it was really a limitation even of sort of Corbynism that, in the end, I mean, I think Jeremy, I love Jeremy Corbyn, but there was two limitations of Corbynism really in terms of the things you've been talking about. One is, in the end, he was a sort of child of Tony Benn. And Tony Benn, although could be very critical of all these things, of all the kind of things we're talking about, he also ultimately believed that like Parliament could be the solution, that Parliament had this sort of destiny to be this democratic institution that had been struggled for since the 17th century. So I don't think Jeremy didn't really believe, as far as I could understand. He didn't really believe like what you said. He seemed to believe that ultimately, if you got a Labour government, they could do socialism, which like a lot of people, including myself and some of the people around him, were always saying, well, we know that's not true. Even if you get a Labour government, the only way you're going to be able to actually do some of the things we're going to want to do is by, really tearing up the current model of institutional politics. So I think all that is completely true. And also, I mean, Jeremy wasn't very good at sort of channeling people's anger. I mean, this is partly the thing you're sort of talking about, and I think it's probably, it is a sort of problem. The issue of emotion in politics you've touched on, I think, is really sort of important, and it is really complicated. And I think one of the things that really appealed to a lot of his most ardent supporters about Jeremy, understandably, was that he represented this absolute decency, this complete sort of no bullshit. It's true. I mean, you wouldn't need to change the system if all politicians were like him. Any system would work because he is genuinely a kind of saintly person who like really means what he says and says what he means, etc. And that was what people liked about it. But in my experience, the kind of person who is no criticism of them, the kind of person who likes that's what they appeal to. They want that sort of image of decency and truth seeking. They're usually people, I mean, they're not, I was going to say sort of middle class, but they're not actually. I mean, I know a lot of people who work in the public sector on very low salaries who are sort of, I think, are like this. And what they saw in Jeremy, as I always used to put it, they saw the headmaster that everyone loves, that everyone knows works a 60-hour week for the kids and all that. But that's a completely different group of people to the people you're talking about, the sort of white working class. I grew up in the Northwest, like in the 80s, and you can't, when I'm talking to you, my accent goes full London. If I'm talking to somebody from Lancashire or Yorkshire, it goes almost full North. because I grew up there and I've lived in London since 1990. But amongst those people, you need something quite different from a guy who's just going to stand up and say, look, we're going to do the decent thing. You need, if you're going to win over that constituency, as he rightly says, currently being won more by the right, you need someone who is going to tell them who are the bastards who are fucking them, excuse my language, and what you're going to do to them. That's what you've got to do. And Jeremy was no good at that. Jeremy couldn't do that. And unfortunately, but that is, the political, we have a political system, including the structures which were put in place by the sort of technocrats, people like Blair and Mandelson in the Labour Party in the 90s, and which still haven't been dismantled, really to make sure that people like that are kept out of politics. They don't get selected as MPs. They do, where that isn't so much the case in the trade union movement. And I would point to like the recent election of Sharon Graham as the leader of Unite, with the second biggest union in the country, as really significant. I mean, she is basically a syndicalist. I mean, her politics are, she's very, Unite supports the Labour Party and talks to the left in the Labour Party, but her politics are often described as syndicalist, meaning they're effectively sort of anarchist. They're very sceptical about the state. They're very sceptical about sort of representative structures. And I think, for me, one grounds for optimism, I've seen, there's all kinds of problems with the union movement always, but the way they've shifted over the past 20 years is really, really dramatic. But I think you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. But one of the big challenges for us is building a coalition on the left that can include the kind of people who, they're attracted to Corbyn's quiet decency, and people who can do that kind of firebrand politics, who can kind of speak to people on the left. Because one of the advantages the right have got is their equivalent of the people who like Corbyn's quiet decency. They're kind of, they're sort of relatively liberal Tories, the sort of people who support, supporting people like Cameron. The thing is, those people, for the most part, are capable of cynically endorsing a figure like a Trump or a Johnson, when they recognise it's in their interests. Right. They're capable of making that. They're much more practiced because they're much more cynical. They make that calculation occasionally. This is what happened with the Republicans in the States. The Republican Party made the calculation, well, you need a Trump at the moment to sort of win these people over. Whereas I think on the left, habitually it's a cliche. People tend to be quite moralistic. People tend to, dislike kind of radical differences in style and presentation. And a lot of people, and I think we do, but I think strategically, I think right now, I think you're absolutely right. We absolutely need some sort of leadership on the left, and there are people who could do it if they could be bothered. In terms of personality and manner, Angela Rayner, we've got no illusions about her politics, but she's a northern woman who left school at 16. If she wanted to stand up and start giving speeches, sort of channeling the class anger of the white working class in Britain, she could do it immediately, and she could win the leadership of the Labour Party and probably become Prime Minister, to be honest. So there are people who could do it. But of course, one of the issues, and this was an issue with Ed, when Ed was leader, it's an issue with lots of people. One of the issues is understandably, people get scared. It's quite easy for us, people like you and me, to sort of sit on the sidelines and say, why don't you do this? Anecdotally, you always hear if any politician looks like they're likely to start doing that and likely to start getting some traction, well, I can't say for sure this is definitely true, because they'll get a call from Murdoch, and Murdoch will just tell them, well, mate, your life's family in misery if you carry on like this. Not just yours, your family's life will be made a misery. And people get scared. So, and it's partly for that reason why we need not just politicians and leaders. We need a strong movement that can back these people up. We need we need to keep building a real culture in which people like the people we would like to be our leaders can be supported to take those kinds of steps.
Yes.
So there you go. It's an interesting discussion. Sometimes I think people in academia are so steeped in knowledge that it becomes kind of
binding. But Jeremy Gilbert and his dear friend, the departed Mark Fisher, are very innovative, brilliant thinkers looking for new ways and models for change. But that's just what I think. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below what you think is missed in the current discourse. Let me know what you think I've missed, how I can advance my thinking so that you and I can learn together individually and collectively. If you enjoyed this video, have a look at this one. If you want to meditate now, have a look at this one. Please, if you enjoy this stuff, consider signing up to Luminary, where I do this content every single week, speaking to a different expert, as well as doing guided meditations. You can get the link on the description if you want to subscribe to it anywhere in the world on Apple. And please sign up to our mailing list by clicking here, and then we can stay connected continually. Stay free.